Hi students, I'm picking up from where we left off. The last transition was a little rough. I think the telephone bell threw me off my game and I think I ran out of time recording, so hopefully I can edit this and we'll pick up right here with some of these concepts. I'm just going to briefly mention these ideas. They'll be in your book and in other readings, and I want you to be sure you can apply these ideas. First of all, well, let me start at the top. Associative bias. What this means is that there are some neutral stimuli that are easierly or better learned, more easy to learn um, as a conditioned stimuli than others. So let's say you've eaten something, you don't feel well, you may have food poisoning, and you happen to be at a restaurant and you observe or some kind of smell. It may not even be the food that caused you to be sick. You can associate that smell of that other food much more than perhaps a bell or the music that was playing in the background. It's more likely that if you're ill, uh, other smells might get associated with being ill as a conditioned stimulus rather than something that has nothing to do with food at all. The notion of contiguity is an important one in all classical conditioning situations. It means that there's a relationship in time. That's important for this association to take hold. It's also important actually in operant theory. In classical conditioning, there's a notion of contingency, and what this is that a lot of research was done about as to when the conditioned stimulus should occur in the context of the unconditioned stimulus. And what has been discovered is that the conditioned stimulus is easier to learn when it occurs right before, seconds before the unconditioned stimulus. And research has actually been able to be very specific with this. There's a notion of generalization. It turns out that the conditioned stimulus, the learned stimulus, let's take Pavlov's dog is conditioned to the sound of a bell. Well, it could be that this conditioning can generalize to other bells, not just a bell in A flat, but maybe a bell on C, a bell in the key of E, and so forth. It's generalized to other ringing things. So, for example, if his office happens to be near a public grammar school, bells ring every 50 minutes, you can imagine that Fred the dog is going to be slobbering all over the place. We can generalize from the specific stimuli that we were conditioned to other similar stimuli. And then there's the notion of extinction. Extinction means, in other words, the connection fades. Now, on one hand, we can say that conditioned stimulus is always going to evoke that conditioned response, but that's not always the case. Take my example of walking to school through rustling leaves. Obviously, over time, the startled effect that I experienced became extinct. Now, it might be that you can say, well, it was replaced by no stimuli, and maybe that's a legitimate thing to consider. But because here I am, a college professor, I obviously kept going to school. So I was able to walk after a period of several days. That startled effect to the sound of rustling leaves stopped. It became faint and eventually quit. Now, there's something called, that I think is really interesting, spontaneous recovery. And what this means is that at some point of time after the behavior became extinct, it could be later that fall or maybe the next year, I'm walking in the woods hear the sound of rustling leaves, and I feel startled. I react in a startled effect. There's a kind of a spontaneous recovery where for a short period of time, the extinct behavior reemerges, but generally it's going to fade over time. It's not going to look, so it's extinction followed by a rest period, and then the conditioned response occurs, but it's going to be less dramatic, and it eventually will fade and reoccur less and less often. And an example of classical conditioning I want you to be familiar with, I actually mentioned it in the presentation in the next unit on operant theory, but it is an example of classical conditioning. Famous behaviorist John Watson conducted a study with little Albert. I want you to become familiar with this. There's a lot written about it. There are many videos online. We've connected you with the video. And the short story is that he did a classical conditioning experiment, and little Albert was afraid of nothing until even this cute little white rat. Now, I would be afraid of that. Supposedly, I've been conditioned to be afraid of that. But little Albert was not afraid of anything until a large gong was sounded when he was playing with this cute little white rat, so that he became afraid. And so he was not afraid of all kinds of things until he was able to be conditioned to be fearful of this white rat. And there are stories that he then generalized this fear to other similar white furry things. And finally, a couple of concepts to think about. One is second order conditioning. This is just, it's not really complex. It's just that the notion that another neutral stimulus is paired with the conditioned stimulus. So it's not paired with the unconditioned stimulus. It gets paired with the conditioned stimulus such that it can elicit the conditioned response. Let me go back to the story of Pavlov's dog, and I like to call him Fred. So Fred is conditioned to salivate to the sound of a bell. What can happen is that they can now use the sound of the bell in the place of the, like an unconditioned stimulus, and they associate with the bell another stimulus, let's say the sound of a metronome. So we can condition Fred the dog to salivate to the bell, and then by pairing the metronome with the bell, he now salivates to the sound of the metronome. So we're building upon the neutral stimuli. One neutral stimuli becomes a conditioned stimuli. We associate that with another new neutral stimulus with that, and it becomes a conditioned stimulus. This is kind of similar. Two neutral stimuli are first paired together. Then one of them is paired with the unconditioned stimulus. The pairing occurred prior to the neutral stimulus becoming the conditioned stimulus, but now the second neutral stimulus elicits the conditioned response. So we've already associated bell and metronome together, and then we train Fred to salivate to the bell by pairing it with food. Then we bring in the metronome, and because the metronome was previously paired with the bell, it now also elicits the conditioned response. And finally, here's this notion of counter conditioning. Now, there are strategies that therapists use working with clients to engage in systematic desensitization to stimuli to decrease phobias. One idea here is that if a person has a non-functional conditioned response to a situation, we can counter that by having them learn a much more functional conditioned response. So I'll just throw that out there as an idea for you to think about. Again, I think we're done with this unit. I've gone through some of the concepts quickly, but certainly you can watch videos that are out there. Watch the Discovering Psychology video on learning at discoveringpsychology.org. And I think it's video number 8 or 9. It's called Learning. I recommend that. I recommend looking at the Little Albert YouTube videos and other videos on classical conditioning. Make sure you see the one on Pavlov. There are several different versions of that video. If you have any questions, as always, contact me through the discussion board. And again, I wish you a good day. And for all of us, let us learn to be kind to one another. Bye now.